It's day 3 of the voter ID trial. We're right now with Marian Schneider, who is one of the lawyers on this case and from the Advancement Project. And the Advancement Project has been an ally of ours on a lot of voting rights issues over the last several years. And Marian, first I just want to ask you about your takeaway from today generally. We heard a lot of different witnesses with a lot of different perspectives. What do you think were the key issues today?
Well, first of all, I think it was a good day. I think it's clear from the Department of State's first witness that there's still a lot of Pennsylvanians that don't know about this voter ID law because they've done their own polling and shown that only 82% of, I think it was 82% was the number of Pennsylvanians that don't even know that this voter ID law is out there. And this is polling that was done late, several months after the bill is passed. And I think we showed with other witnesses that there are still people who cannot get a PennDOT ID because they don't have the documentation to get it. But then with some of our other witnesses, we showed that there are people who have severe hardship in getting to a PennDOT center, and it's not trivial and it's burdensome.
I'm glad you brought that up because over the last few days we've been hearing from a number of our witnesses who have problems with the documentation, and we've heard references to the difficulty of getting to PennDOT, but today we really heard a really compelling story from a young man from Chester County who has all the documentation, but he has an issue getting the ID itself. Can you explain that?
Yes. Taylor Floria is a 19-year-old young man. He is a high school student, and he wants to register and vote this year, but he suffers from autism. And he also has a mitochondrial disorder that causes chronic fatigue syndrome. So there's several issues for Taylor. First of all, he's about an hour from the driver's license center by car. There's no public transportation. He couldn't navigate it anyway, but he gets car sick. It's very fatiguing for him to go. But then once he gets there, the sensory stimuli at the at the PennDOT Center is overwhelming to him, and it causes him to shut down. He can't process all the stimuli. It's very unpredictable. It's scary for him, and it's an exhausting ordeal. In fact, he's actually tried to go and get his ID, but he couldn't get it, and he had to leave because it was too much. It was too exhausting, and he shut down. He gets to a point where he cannot even communicate. He's a very bright young man, a very sweet young man, and he's not going to be able to get his ID. And he came here today to speak up for all of the disabled people who can't speak for themselves and who can't get to PennDOT and might not be able to vote in November.
And you also talked with you handled the examination of Taylor, and you talked with him about the fact that he came here today. So what was the difference? Why was he able to come here today but can't go to a PennDOT center?
Well, first of all, he came last night, so he was able to rest and recover from the long ride. And second of all, because this is something that is typical of autistic people, but they have sort of an OCD or obsessive-compulsive component to it. But there's order and predictability in a courtroom where people are expected to dress and behave in a certain way, and he understands that. And there's a judge that keeps control over the courtroom, and he's able to deal with that in a way that doesn't happen when you go to a PennDOT center. As everyone who's ever been to a PennDOT center knows that there's random people moving around, and it's a lot of noise and a lot of stimuli.
We also heard today from a couple of state officials, one from the Department of State, Shannon Royer, Deputy Secretary, and also Kurt Myers, who is the Deputy Secretary for PennDOT. Now, Secretary Royer was brought on by the state, actually, but Kurt Myers was a witness for our team. What did you make of their testimony?
Well, we already discussed Royer's testimony, and his testimony was about the media campaign, but they have not rolled out their full media campaign, and they're not planning to do it until September, which seems to me that is very late in the game. That leaves 2 months before the election for people to get their ID. So I think that it's not enough, and their own polling shows that a lot of people don't know about the law and don't know what they need to get an ID. The second thing, Secretary Myers, it's clear that they're not staffing up, they have not hired more people, they're not extending their hours, and they are just planning to issue this DOS ID to a very small number of people. If we have 1 million or more people that don't have ID, they're not going to be able to handle it.
And I thought it was interesting that Michelle Levy, and this is the final question, Michelle Levy from Homeless Advocacy Project testified after Deputy Secretary Royer, because he talked about how the bulk of their public education campaign is going to be after Labor Day, And then Ms. Levy came on the stand and said, in their experience getting people birth certificates, it can take 10 to 12 weeks if they ask for it expedited, to a year to never. What did you make of Ms. Levy's testimony?
I thought she was great. She had very compelling stories of people she has tried to help get birth certificates for years, that it's expensive, it's time consuming, and it's complicated. And so for them to expect that people are going to be able to get out-of-state birth certificates from September to November is completely unrealistic. And they also testified today that to get the new DOS ID, they're going to have to show that they tried to get their birth certificate from out of state. So they're just putting people in an impossible situation.
Well, Marian, appreciate your time and all your hard work. It's the weekend, so it's time to get some rest, I guess.
There's no rest for the weary.
Thanks.